In the early winter of 1943, the American sky was filled with frustration. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was supposed to be the pride of American engineering, a steel giant with a roaring Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the largest and most powerful radial engine ever placed in a fighter plane. They called it the Jug, a beast so big and heavy that even its pilots joked about it being more tank than airplane. It looked unstoppable, but inside its heart there was a flaw that no one could ignore. It could not climb high above France and Belgium. American bombers were flying straight into German gunfire, escorted by Thunderbolts that struggled to keep up with the formations below them. The Luftwaffe waited for them like wolves among sheep. Sleek Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s circling the sky, waiting for a chance to strike. They dove through the bomber formations, their machine guns lighting the air. Then they pulled up into steep climbs, disappearing into the clouds where the heavy Thunderbolts could never follow. The American pilots cursed into their radios, watching the German fighters vanish overhead, powerless to chase them down on the ground. At the Republic Aviation plant in Farmingdale, Long Island, the engineers read the combat reports with silent dread. Every page carried the same message: the Thunderbolt is too heavy, too slow to climb, too easy to escape. Alexander Kartveli, the chief designer, walked the length of the assembly floor, his boots echoing on the steel. He had designed the Thunderbolt to be the ultimate high-altitude escort fighter built around raw engine power and armor that could take hits no other fighter could survive. But power was meaningless if it could not reach the fight in time. At one test base in England, a pilot named Frank O'Hare wrote in his notebook, after a mission, the Germans dive on us like hawks. We try to chase them up and the Thunderbolt gasps like an old horse by the time we reach altitude. They're gone. The mechanics blamed the engine, the pilots blamed the airframe, but Kartveli knew where the real problem lay. The Thunderbolt's propeller was too thin, too narrow. It cut through the air like a knife when what it needed was a hand to grab it. The Pratt & Whitney engine produced 2,000 horsepower, but the propeller attached to it, the Curtiss electric model with its slim blades, could not convert that power into upward thrust at high altitudes. The engine screamed, but the aircraft barely rose. It was like harnessing a hurricane to spin a feather. The reports came from every front: Germany, Italy, England, pilots describing the same humiliation. German fighters diving, attacking, and then climbing away to safety untouchable. In January 1943, the headquarters of Republic Aviation became a war room, not of generals but of engineers. Kartveli spread the reports across a long table filled with blueprints, his eyes moving between numbers and performance graphs. The Thunderbolt could reach speeds over 400 miles per hour in a dive, but climbing to that speed took forever. He turned to his team and said quietly, "We built a giant, now we need to teach it how to fly." The engineers worked through nights, their breath fogging in the cold air of the drafting rooms. They drew new propeller shapes on tracing paper, wide, thick blades that looked more like oars than wings. Some laughed. It looked absurd, clumsy against the elegant thin blades used on German fighters. But Kartveli saw something the others did not. The Germans built perfection on paper. We will build what works in the sky. Every change risked disaster. A wrong curve could tear the propeller apart at full speed. Too much weight could snap the engine mounts. Vibrations could destroy the airframe, but they had no choice. American pilots were dying because the Thunderbolt could not climb to save them, while the engineers struggled in Long Island. The air war over Europe grew worse. In early 1943, the Luftwaffe dominated the sky. The American bombers flying daylight raids over Germany suffered terrible losses. They needed escorts that could follow them into the stratosphere, but the Thunderbolt could barely reach 25,000 feet without overheating. A German pilot from Jagerschwader 26 wrote in his diary, "The American Jug is strong but slow. Once we climb above them, they are helpless. We play with them before we strike." The laughter from the enemy echoed across the radio frequencies as German pilots taunted their American pursuers, "Climb, Jug, climb if you can." But the Thunderbolt could not. Its pilots returned home in silence, their faces gray with exhaustion, their fuel tanks empty, their pride cracked by the reality that their enemy owned the vertical world above them. In one bitter mission over Holland, a young pilot named Walker Mahurin watched his wingman fall to a Messerschmitt that climbed away after firing a short burst. Walker pulled on his stick, tried to follow the German fighter upwards. The engine roared, the gauges screamed, but the aircraft refused to rise. He felt the shudder as airspeed bled away. He knew if he pushed any harder the Jug would stall and spin. He leveled off helplessly, watching the German disappear into the sun. He wrote later that day, "I felt like throwing my helmet into the sea. We have the most powerful engine in the world, and we can't catch a single German news of these encounters." Reached Washington, reports piled on desks marked urgent. Cardvelli's team was given a simple but impossible order: fix the Thunderbolt's climb without redesigning the plane. They had months, not years, inside the wind tunnel at the Curtiss-Wright plant in Ohio. Engineers tested blade shapes by candlelight. The war demanded speed, not perfection. They cut new molds from aluminum, increasing blade width by inches. Every inch added more lift but also more drag. They balanced equations of life and death through math and instinct. The noise in the test room was deafening, the sound of wind screaming at 400 miles per hour across the ocean. In England, mechanics of the 56th Fighter Group waited, their letters home filled with questions from families who did not understand why American planes could not beat German ones. The pilots hid their frustration behind jokes, calling the jug the flying brick, but deep down they wondered if the next mission would be their last. On a gray morning in March, a telegram arrived at Republic Aviation from the Army Air Force's approval granted for prototype testing of paddle blade propellers, both Hamilton Standard and Curtiss-Wright designs. Cardvelli held the paper for a long moment, knowing this was their last chance. He called his engineers back to the drafting tables and said one sentence that no one forgot: "We will make this beast climb if it kills us." And so began the race against time, the story of engineers fighting gravity itself. The Thunderbolt stood in the hangar like a sleeping giant, its silver skin streaked with oil, its propeller blades slim and tired, waiting to be reborn. Outside, snow fell quietly across Long Island as men worked through the night to forge the wide new blades that would one day slice the air above Berlin. And somewhere across the Atlantic, German pilots celebrated another easy victory, unaware that in the factories of America a small change in the shape of a blade was about to change the shape of the entire war. The winter of 1943 sank deep into the factories of America. The cold air smelled of metal, oil, and sweat, while outside the world slept men. Inside, Republic Aviation and Curtiss-Wright plants fought a different kind of war, not with bullets but with mathematics and blueprints. They called themselves mechanics, but they were soldiers of physics, each one carrying the weight of pilots who died in the sky above Europe every day. Alexander Cardvelli stood over the drafting tables, his fingers stained with graphite, his eyes burning with exhaustion. He was not chasing perfection anymore, he was chasing survival. The problem was clear: the Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine could deliver 2,000 horsepower, but the thin propeller blades could not catch enough air at full throttle. They spun uselessly, the air slipping past their narrow edges. Cardvelli imagined the sky itself as a battlefield, the propeller as a soldier swinging a sword that never quite struck its target. They needed not a sword but a hammer, and so began the birth of the paddle blade propeller in a small hangar in Dayton, Ohio. Engineers from Curtiss Electric Propeller Company tested blade shapes cut from wood before casting them in aluminum. The first design was thick, blunt, and ugly, the kind of thing that looked like it belonged on a windmill, not a fighter plane. Some laughed, but the chief engineer, Fred Linden, called it beautiful because it promised resistance. He explained to his team, when the engine turns at 2,000 revolutions per minute, this wider blade will grab the air like a hand, not slice it like a knife. It will turn force into lift. They mounted the first prototype on a test rig. The noise shook the walls when the engine fired. The whole building trembled, but the tachometer showed something new. The climb rate was rising, the airflow stable, no vibration, no stall. Cardvelli received the results by telegram. The message was short: blade number 7 produces 20% more thrust than standard model. He read it twice, then once more, his tired eyes suddenly alive. That 20% meant more than numbers, it meant lives, but nothing was certain. They still had to prove it in flight. In the early spring of 1944, the Army Air Forces sent orders to produce limited test blades, both Hamilton Standard and Curtiss Electric versions. Cardvelli selected a single Thunderbolt for modification, painted silver bare metal. The mechanics removed the old slim blades, their hands frozen by the cold, and replaced them with the wide paddle blades, the first of their kind. The blades gleamed under the hangar lights, thick edges curved like muscles ready to fight gravity. On a cold morning in Long Island, the test pilot climbed into the cockpit. His name was Roger Freeman, known for steady hands and nerves of steel. The engine started with a cough, then a thunder that rolled across the airfield. Mechanics held their breath as the giant aircraft began to roll down the runway, slowly at first, then faster. The nose lifted, the roar deep in the aircraft surged upward, not sluggish, not gasping, but climbing hard straight into the blue. The spectators shouted. They had never seen a Thunderbolt rise like that before. At 3,000 feet, it was already faster than the old model could manage in a dive. At 10, the test lasted 9 minutes. When Freeman landed, he stepped out of the cockpit, his face red from windburn. He looked at Cardvelli and said nothing, just raised his thumb and smiled. The data confirmed what everyone felt: the new propeller worked. It had turned the jug from a struggling brute into something powerful, sleek, alive. The climb rate improved by nearly 30%, the ceiling higher, the response sharper, the vibration lower. For the first time the Thunderbolt could meet the German fighters where they lived, in the thin air above the clouds. Word spread quickly through the bases across the United States and England. Mechanics whispered about the new propellers that looked like boat paddles. Rumors called them monster blades. The pilots called them angels of climb. The army ordered immediate production, thousands of sets to be shipped overseas by summer. The factories ran day and night, forging aluminum, shaping it, cooling it, fitting it to new hubs. The workers no longer joked about flying bricks. They knew they were building wings for victory. Back in Europe, American bomber losses still mounted, but the tide was about to turn. The first squadrons to receive the modified P-47s were the 56th and 78th Fighter Group stationed in England. When the crates arrived, they looked strange to the men inside the cold hangars who had seen too much death. They unpacked the shining blades and ran their fingers along the edges. Wide, strong, heavy. One mechanic whispered, "They look like they could fight the air itself." The installation began under flickering lamps in wet hangars. The men worked through the night, bolting the new propellers, aligning them, balancing them, testing each motor spin. The sound was different, deeper, more muscular. When the engines started, the air around them shivered, the ground vibrated like a drum. The pilots who stood nearby grinned. They could feel the promise of power in the vibrations under their boots. Among them was Major Hubert Zemke, leader of the 56th Fighter Group, a man who had lost too many friends to German claws. He climbed into his Thunderbolt the next morning for the first test flight. Clouds hung low over the English countryside. The runway glistened with rain. He pushed the throttle forward and the aircraft responded like a beast, unleashed. It tore through the mist, climbing faster than he thought possible. He radioed the tower, only one sentence: "She climbs like she means it." Back in the control room, the engineers stared at the instruments, their pens frozen above the paper. The climb graph rose like a mountain. The chatter on the radio was laughter, disbelief, joy. When Zemke landed his Thunderbolt taxied to a stop, he climbed down drenched in rain and sweat. He turned to the ground crew and said, "This thing can finally breathe." Across the ocean in Germany, reports began to trickle into the Luftwaffe intelligence office. Allied fighters showing unusual performance above Britain. Increased climb rate, unknown type, suspected new model. Messerschmitt engineers dismissed it. One colonel saying, "American engines are too heavy, they cannot sustain altitude, let them dream." But the dream was already real, and soon it would become their nightmare. By May 1944, hundreds of Thunderbolts equipped with paddle blade propellers were flying from English airfields, their polished edges gleaming in the morning sun. Pilots who once cursed their planes now trusted them with their lives. Each new mission climbed higher, faster, reaching the bomber streams before the German fighters could dive. The tables of the sky were turning. The Thunderbolt no longer crawled, it soared. At the Republic factory, Cartvelli watched a new row of completed fighters roll out of the hangar, each one fitted with the broad blades that had cost him months of sleep. He felt no pride, only relief, because every time a plane climbed faster, another pilot might live, another bomber might return home. The war in the air was changing, not with a new weapon or a miracle, but with a simple shape of metal forged by human stubbornness. In England, that same night, Zemke wrote a note in his journal: "I used to look up and see the enemy above, now I look down and see him trying to reach me." And somewhere in a smoky office in Berlin, a German intelligence officer circled a photograph of a Thunderbolt with strange wide propeller blades. He frowned and wrote in the margin, "What have they done?" The engineers who fought gravity had done it. They had turned a flying brick into the fist of the sky, and though the world would never know their names, the pilots would never forget the day their machines learned to climb. The summer of 1944 rolled across England wrapped in gray clouds and the hum of engines. The airfields were alive with motion, the ground crews soaked in fuel and rain wiping oil from the wings of machines that were no longer jokes. The Thunderbolts lined up across the tarmac, their new wide paddle blade propellers gleaming under the dull light of dawn. The men who worked on them called them the new breath of the jug, and in their hearts they knew something had changed. The days of slow climbs and helpless escorts were over. At Wattisham Airfield, the 56th Fighter Group prepared for its first mission with the new blades. The mechanics tightened bolts, adjusted cowlings, checked instruments, their hands shaking not from cold but from anticipation. Major Hubert Zemke walked the line of aircraft, his boots splashing through puddles, his eyes sharp. He stopped beside a Thunderbolt marked with the name Bonnie Sue painted in red cursive on the nose. The pilot, Lieutenant Frank O'Hare, stood nearby, cigarette trembling in his mouth. Zemke said quietly, "The Germans won't know what hit them." The radio crackled. The order came. Engines on the airfield came alive. With a deep rumble that shook the ground, the sound was different, richer, heavier. The propellers cut the air with a rhythm that felt alive. The old Thunderbolt had sounded like strain. This one sounded like hunger. The pilots taxied into position. Rain whipped across the windshields and the control tower cleared them for takeoff. Zemke led the formation down the runway, the planes rising one after another into the fog, disappearing into the low clouds. Bound for France above the English Channel, the formation climbed through the gray sea of mist. The gauges showed steady climb rates unheard of before. The new blades grabbed the air, pulling the heavy machines upward with ease. Zemke watched his altimeter climb past 20,000 feet, then 25, then 28. The engines, the vibration smooth. He smiled behind his oxygen mask and whispered, "This is how it should have been from the start." Across the channel, the German radar stations picked up the incoming blips. Another bomber escort. They thought nothing special. The controllers directed squadrons of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs to intercept. The same pattern as always. The German pilots had grown used to the Thunderbolts, slow, heavy, easy to outclimb. They expected another easy hunt. They took off, confident, climbing into the cold sky above occupied France, but something was different. The American formation did not stay low. They climbed higher, faster. When the German fighters broke through the cloud tops at 30,000 feet, expecting to look down on their prey, they found the Thunderbolts waiting for them, level at altitude, guns already armed. The first clash came without warning, tracer rounds cutting the sky. Zemke's voice over the radio: "Steady, stay tight, watch your wings, don't chase down, pull them up, let them come to you." One German pilot, Lieutenant Hans Becker, saw a Thunderbolt ahead and dove on it as he always did, expecting the American to flee. He fired a burst, then pulled back on his stick to climb away, but the Thunderbolt turned and rose after him, matching his climb, the massive machine roaring through the clouds. Hans shouted into his radio, "They are following, they should not be able to climb like this." His wingman did not answer because his plane was already spiraling down. Within minutes, the sky became chaos, German formations breaking apart as the Thunderbolts pressed the attack from below and above. The wide blades gave them new energy in turns and climbs. The Americans no longer feared altitude. They owned it. Zemke's guns blazed, his bullets ripping through the wings of a Focke-Wulf that tried to roll away. It burst into flame and vanished into the clouds, the radio filled with shouts, laughter, disbelief from the American pilots. They couldn't believe what their planes were doing down on the ground. German radar operators watched their screens, confused. The American fighters were holding altitude longer than ever. They did not drop back, they did not slow. Reports flooded in from different sectors: "Our planes cannot shake them, our planes cannot dive away." The command center in Paris demanded explanations. The intelligence officers blamed weather, misread instruments, mechanical error. No one wanted to believe that the Americans had changed the laws of the sky. Back in England, the returning pilots landed to applause from mechanics and officers alike. They stepped out of their cockpits, grinning faces streaked with oil and sweat. Zemke wrote in his logbook, "Today we took back the air." The men gathered in the briefing room afterwards, still buzzing with adrenaline. One said, "I chased a Focke-Wulf straight up to 30,000 feet and he stalled before I did." Another added, "I used to dread the climb, now I can't wait for it." They laughed, the kind of laughter born from relief from knowing the tide had turned. As the reports reached Washington, the Army Air Forces finally understood the magnitude of what had happened. A small engineering change, a curve of metal, had transformed an aircraft's destiny. The Thunderbolt now climbed faster than any German fighter. Above 20,000 feet, it could dive like a stone and rise again like a hawk. It was no longer a defensive escort, it was a predator. Cartvelli received the combat reports at his desk. He read the words again and again: climb rate, unmatched performance, above 30,000 feet, German fighters unable to engage effectively. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes and exhaled. For the first time in months, the work had paid off. He looked around at his exhausted engineers and said quietly, "They thought we were too heavy to fly, now we are too strong to fall." By July 1944, the Thunderbolt with paddle blade propellers dominated the skies over France. During the Normandy campaign, it escorted bombers, smashed ground targets and dueled German fighters. With newfound confidence, the Luftwaffe struggled to adapt. Their pilots wrote in diaries about the new jug that climbed like a devil. Rumors spread that the Americans had hidden superchargers or new engines. No one guessed the truth, that it was simply the blade of a propeller widened by a few inches. In one mission over Paris, Major Zemke led his squadron through thick clouds hunting enemy planes. His wingman spotted a formation of Focke-Wulfs below. Zemke dove rolled and fired his guns. The German leader tried to pull up to escape, but Zemke's Thunderbolt followed relentlessly, their engines screaming at full power. Both planes climbed through the gray void until the German stalled, flipping onto its back. The American bullets tore through its fuselage. It exploded in a flash of orange that lit the clouds. Zemke's voice came through the radio, calm and firm. "We own the climb now, boys." As the Thunderbolts returned home, their wings scarred, their pilots weary. The mechanics looked at the new blades with awe. One young man touched the edge of a propeller still warm from flight and whispered, "This piece of metal just changed the war." He was right across the English coast. The sunset painted the sky red and gold. The Thunderbolts descended in perfect formation like eagles coming home, their wide blades slicing the air with authority and grace. In Berlin, reports arrived at the Luftwaffe command. The Americans possess a modified propeller design, significantly improving high-altitude performance. Urgent research requested. The German engineers studied captured photos of downed Thunderbolts, their fingers tracing the thick blades. One whispered, "This is not possible," yet the evidence lay before them, a shape simple and devastating. That night, Zemke wrote another line in his journal: "We used to climb into death, now we climb into victory." And as the engines cooled and the last light faded from the hangars, the secret over England was no longer a secret, it was a promise. The Thunderbolt had become something new, something the Germans never expected, a machine that could finally reach the sky they once owned. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Europe had turned into a vast arena where nations fought not for land but for air supremacy. And on a cold morning in March, Berlin waited for the sound of thunder. The American bombers were coming again, massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses, escorted by the reborn Thunderbolts that no one in Germany yet understood. The Luftwaffe stood ready, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lined up along runways, their pilots confident, their officers repeating the same words they had spoken for years: "We control the climb, we own the air above 30,000 feet." But that morning the sky had other plans. At dawn the engines started across German airfields, the sound of hundreds of propellers slicing the air. The Messerschmitt pilots took off, rising in tight spirals, their silver wings flashing in the pale sun above them. Dark shapes approached from the west, bombers moving in endless rows, their vapor trails stretching across the horizon. But what caught the Germans by surprise were the escorts, hundreds of Thunderbolts flying high, already at altitude faster and higher than any reports had claimed. The German leader shouted into his radio, "They should not be up here, they cannot be this high." The first attack came near Magdeburg. German fighters dove from above, expecting to pierce the bomber stream as always, but the Thunderbolts broke formation and rose to meet them. They climbed straight into the dive, their paddle blade propellers biting the air, their engines roaring like storms. The German leader, Lieutenant Hans Becker, recognized the shape ahead. The same jug he had mocked months earlier. He dove, fired his cannons, then pulled back on his stick to climb away as he had done countless times. But the Thunderbolt followed it, climbed after him, steady, relentless. His instruments screamed, his climb rate failed. He looked over his shoulder, the American machine growing larger, its guns flashing. He shouted to his wingman, "I cannot shake him," before static drowned his voice. The American bullets tore through the air, hitting his left wing. His plane burst into smoke, spinning downward. The Thunderbolt rolled and kept climbing, hunting another target in the clouds. The German formations scattered, confusion spreading across their radios, reports flooding command lines. The Americans climb faster now. How can this be? The controllers at ground command refused to believe it, insisting maintain altitude, wait for them to drop. But they never dropped. From his cockpit, Major Hubert Zemke watched the enemy disintegrate below, the German formations breaking apart like glass under pressure. He pushed his throttle forward, the roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine shaking his chest. He could feel the pulse of the paddle blades biting the sky. His plane rose higher than he had ever dared before. He spoke calmly over the radio, "We are above them now, boys, keep it tight. This is our sky now." On the ground, civilians in small German towns looked up and saw something new. The American fighters were not fleeing, they were chasing, their sleek silhouettes cutting across the sun. Contrails weaving silver scars across the blue. The Thunderbolt had become a symbol of inevitability, of power born from persistence. German soldiers watched in disbelief as the very machines they once ridiculed ruled the sky above their cities. The hum of the engines echoed prophecy inside the command bunker outside Berlin. General Adolf Galland received the reports with growing frustration. He had been Luftwaffe's pride, its ace and strategist. Now he paced before a wall map covered in red markers representing destroyed squadrons. His officers whispered theories. Some said the Americans had developed new turbo superchargers, others believed new fuel mixtures. Galland slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "It is not the engine, something in the air, something in their design." Far away across the English Channel, in a muddy airfield, Zemke's mechanics worked without sleep, replacing spent barrels, refueling, polishing the new blades before The next mission, one mechanic looked at the thick propeller edge and said, "She climbs like vengeance." The others nodded because they had seen it with their own eyes. Each mission the jug climbed higher, faster, and returned more victorious. The laughter that once followed its name had turned into respect. By April 1944, the Thunderbolt dominated escort missions over Germany. The bombers now reached Berlin with minimal losses. Thunderbolts met every attack with ruthless efficiency. American pilots who once prayed to survive the climb now hunted freely above 30,000 feet. Zemke's group alone shot down dozens of German fighters in a single week. They called it the Thunder Week. On one mission near Leipzig, Lieutenant Frank O'Hare spotted a formation of Focke-Wulfs diving toward the bombers. He climbed to intercept. His altimeter spun, the engine screamed, the new propeller biting the air. His plane leapt upward as if dragged by invisible hands. He met the German leader head-on. Their guns blazing at 500 miles per hour. They crossed paths. O'Hare rolled inverted, came around behind him, and fired. The enemy plane exploded in mid-air. His wingman shouted over the radio, "I saw it." He climbed straight through him. On the same day, a German pilot wrote in his diary, "They rise like demons. I saw one jug pass my altitude at 40,000 feet. I had no more power to follow. It was impossible, yet it happened. We are losing the sky each day." That spring the Thunderbolts took off in waves from England, their engines forming a low, endless growl across the countryside. Villagers stopped to watch them climb, disappearing into the clouds. Children pointed, calling them the Metal Eagles. The transformation was complete. What began as a heavy, sluggish machine had become the most feared guardian in the air war. Its strength unmatched, its endurance legendary. At Republic Aviation, Kartveli received a telegram from Europe. It read simply, "Performance exceeds expectation. Pilots report dominance at high altitude." He pinned the message above his desk, beside the first sketch of the paddle blade drawn on a coffee-stained napkin, a reminder that the smallest curve of metal had rewritten the story of flight. By June, the Allied invasion of Normandy began. Thunderbolts roared across the beaches, strafing German positions, destroying tanks, convoys, rail lines, while still escorting bombers above France. German resistance in the air grew desperate. Every time they tried to intercept, they found Thunderbolts waiting at their altitude like silent predators. The Germans looked up and saw the shape of defeat carved into the sky. Zemke led his squadron over the front lines, that weak clouds of smoke rising from the coast, the radio filled with fragments of voices, orders, shouts, prayers. His hands steady on the stick, his eyes searching the horizon. He spotted enemy fighters climbing from the east. He ordered his men, "Tighten up, stay with me, we end this here." The formation met them head-on, machine guns flashing trails of fire across the dawn. Within minutes the sky was filled with falling planes, black smoke twisting into the sea. On the ground, Allied troops looked up, cheering the American fighters chasing the enemy away. One soldier wrote home that night, "I saw our planes fight above the beach. They moved like thunder, like gods." By midsummer, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the air over Germany. Fuel shortages crippled them. Experienced pilots lost replacements. Untrained, the once invincible Sky Force reduced to scattered formations, hiding in clouds. Every time they climbed, Thunderbolts appeared above them like hunters that had learned every trick of their prey. In September 1944, Zemke's group was ordered deeper into German territory, now escorting bombers all the way to Berlin itself. The Thunderbolts led the formation over the capital, their wide blades shimmering in the sunlight, the same sunlight that once crowned the German eagle, now reflected from American wings. Zemke looked down through his canopy, saw the city below, and whispered to himself, "They can no longer look down on us, they can only look up." And that was the day the Germans looked up and realized the sky they thought was theirs belonged to someone else. A nation that had refused to accept gravity had forged a machine that turned humiliation into supremacy. The Thunderbolt climbed not just through clouds but through history itself. The war was ending, and the sky that had burned with fire now lay quiet. The Thunderbolt rested in hangars across England, its metal skin scarred by bullets, its wide blades dull from dust and victory. It had flown longer and harder than any pilot ever imagined it could. The same men who once cursed its weight now touched its wings with affection, whispering thanks beneath their breath. They knew that this machine had carried them home when others fell. It had outlasted fear, outclimbed death itself. In May 1945, Germany surrendered Berlin in ruins, its streets filled with silence and the ghosts of ambition. The Luftwaffe was gone. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that Once ruled the air sat broken among the rubble. A few captured German engineers were brought to Allied airfields to study American aircraft. They stood before a Thunderbolt parked beneath the open sky. One of them reached out and ran his hand along the wide propeller blade. He murmured something under his breath, an admission perhaps, or a confession. Another engineer beside him said quietly, "This shape defeated us." American officers watched as the Germans examined the machine, notebooks in hand, faces solemn. They had once laughed at the design, called it clumsy, inefficient, but now they understood the genius of simplicity. The paddle blade had allowed the Thunderbolt to use every ounce of its engine's power without compromise. It was the smallest detail, yet it changed everything. The Germans realized that in war arrogance is as deadly as any bullet. Across the Atlantic, the factories of Republic Aviation began to slow the war. Contracts ending. The workers who had built the Thunderbolts returned to their homes, many unaware that they had shaped the outcome of a global war. Cartvelli walked through the empty assembly line one last time, the smell of oil and aluminum still in the air. He stopped beside a finished aircraft, its surface gleaming under the lights. He placed a hand on the blade that had changed the world and whispered to himself, it was never the engine, it was the air all along. In the years that followed, Germany rebuilt from the ashes. The same engineers who once designed war machines now turned to piece their new industries, studied American technology, adapting and improving. Within a decade, German companies like Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf were reborn as manufacturers of civilian aircraft and turbines. They applied lessons learned from their defeat: wide propellers, efficient airflow, balanced design. They never mocked the paddle blade again. They embraced it. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, continued to serve across the world, in Europe, in the Pacific, in Korea, its legend growing with every mission. Pilots from new generations learned its story. They marveled that such a massive aircraft could fight with grace, that a few inches of metal could change destiny. They called it the Jug, the hammer of the skies, and in museums decades later, people still stood before it in awe. Children pressed their faces to the glass, watching the giant silver propeller glint under soft lights, while veterans stood quietly behind them, remembering the sound of that engine echoing through the clouds. In one of those museums years after the war, an American pilot and a German engineer met by coincidence. They both paused before the same Thunderbolt, displayed in silence, its propeller frozen mid-turn. The pilot broke the silence, saying, "This one used to chase us home from every mission." The engineer smiled sadly and replied, "And it used to chase us from the sky." They stood together for a moment, looking at the machine that had connected them through death and survival. Then the German said softly, "We learned from it." The pilot nodded. "That's the point of winning, isn't it? That everyone learns." Outside the museum, the world had moved on. Jets now ruled the air, the age of propellers fading into memory, but the lesson remained carved into every blueprint that followed: technology, humility, adaptation. The Thunderbolt had not won the war alone, but it had proved something that would outlive every engine, every empire. Sometimes the smallest change reshapes the largest fate. Cartvelli spent his later years designing new aircraft, watching the dawn of the jet age. He often told students that victory belongs not to strength but to the refusal to stop improving. When asked what he was most proud of, he said, "Not the engine, not the speed, but that we made a plane once mocked for its weight become the guardian of the sky." By the 1960s, Germany and America stood no longer as enemies but as partners, rebuilding the world through science and cooperation. In their factories and laboratories, one could still see echoes of that wartime lesson: the wide blades now transformed into jet fan designs, the same principle of airflow efficiency shaping the next generation of flight. What began as desperation in a Long Island hangar had become the foundation of modern aerodynamics, and so the Thunderbolt's story came to rest not as a relic of war but as a monument to progress. It was proof that innovation thrives under pressure, that stubbornness can become salvation, that even in the darkest times the human drive to rise above limitation can carve wings out of metal. And hope. The Germans never expected paddle blade props to transform the Thunderbolt into a 470-mile-per-hour monster, but the truth was greater than any headline, because behind every revolution there are people who refuse to accept that gravity wins, and somewhere in a quiet hangar the last Thunderbolt sits beneath a shaft of sunlight, its broad propeller still its metal faded but proud, as if waiting to take off one more time, the air around it whispering the story of the day mankind learned that no weight is too heavy when the will to rise is stronger than the pull of the earth, and in that stillness lies the lesson of speed and strength, that progress is the real victory and that every generation must build its own wings.